Matoka was the real name of the lady we know as Pocahontas. And that was kind of a family nickname they gave her because she was a very playful little girl. And then later she was known as Rebecca. So she had 3 names in one lifetime. And she was, I consider, the mother of the United States of America. Nobody else has said that. I am. Had it not been for this one woman, the settlement of North America would have been vastly different. She was, by all accounts, a force for reconciliation and peace. She was a very spiritual woman. I first was imbued with the story of Pocahontas as a small lad when I was 7 or 8 years old. My parents and grandparents would share the story. But one of my things my parents always taught me was try to understand the other person's point of view. You don't have to like them, you don't have to agree with it, but try to understand the other person's point of view. What they were trying to do was trying to teach me to understand Pocahontas's parents' point of view, Powhatan. We don't know much about her mother. And basically what we were taught in school and college until at least 50 years ago was the English point of view of Pocahontas, mainly because it was the English who wrote the story down, and Powhatan's tribe, they didn't have written language. They had an oral tradition, but not a written language. So consequently, we don't have anything written down about what their thoughts were and what their interpretation of events were. All we understand is basically what John Smith wrote and a few other people. The Spanish, French, Portuguese, and English considered the Western Hemisphere as their automatic and divine right, and indigenous people had to move over and move out of the way. Never mind that this land is the burial ground for all of their ancestors for hundreds and hundreds of years. I would like for you to think about what we would think about if a North Korean vessel entered the Houston Ship Channel with arms on their boat, disembark, build a fort, and say we're here and this is our land. I don't think it was set too well. Yet, Pocahontas' father, who was Powhatan, and he was the chief of the Confederacy of the Algonquin-speaking peoples. He wanted to see what this group of people were up to. His brother wanted to stomp them out, get rid of them. And he had a different point of view. He wanted to understand what the motives of these people, maybe they can help us somehow. But first, before we go into that story, I want to talk about the Roanoke colony in North Carolina, the next state over from where Pocahontas was, which was now current state of Virginia. And there was a man in the colony named John White. And fortunately, he was a pretty good illustrator. Sometimes the proportion of the humans are not what I call artistically perfect, but this is our first glimpse, visual glimpse, except for cave art that we have found. This was the first Englishman's and Englishwoman's glimpse of the people and the flora and the fauna of the tidewaters of Virginia and, in this case, North Carolina. He went back to get more supplies for this Roanoke colony. They were running out of supplies. And when he came back, he couldn't find the colony. So it was over. But he drew these pictures. And I'm only showing us some of them. He drew dozens and dozens. Well, he went back to England, and people lined up for blocks to see these pictures. Imagine if we, on the headlines tomorrow morning's paper, said, we've discovered this planet that's occupied with people. Man, we would want to see these people immediately. You know, let's put them on the TV, take pictures of them. Let's talk to them if we can. Anyways, the men and the women only wore long, and this is in the spring, summer, and fall. They wore more clothes in the wintertime. But in the fall, in the spring, summer, and fall, both men and women only wore a loincloth around the waist. He also drew animals that he saw, and birds and so forth. Now, this is one of a good picture, example of the women. Notice nothing on the top, and they were carrying gourds for water, transporting water, and so forth. And he also noticed that they had jewelry in some cases. He noticed they danced around these poles, and I would have loved for an ethnographer to have interviewed them, to ask them what this was all about. Why were we doing this? What value to your community was this? Was this entertainment? Was it spiritual and religious? We don't know. But he drew pictures of it, and if he hadn't, we wouldn't have had pictures of the early day Native Americans in the eastern United States. He noticed they liked to get around the campfire and tell stories. Now, back to Jamestown. When the ships first arrived in the tidewaters of Virginia, the Captain Newport, who was the captain of the vessel, he did not want to be visible to the Spanish vessels. One reason that they were there, the English government was very concerned about the fact that the Spanish now had Central America, half of South America, Florida, all of the Southwest, of which we're sitting now, from Texas all the way to Oregon, would belong to Spain. And they knew that if they didn't get busy and have colonies, they were going to lose out on what they thought were the treasures of the Western Hemisphere. One reason they came to Jamestown was looking for gold and silver, which they didn't find. So that was a great disappointment. And one of the people they brought along on the mission was John Smith. And John Smith was actually chained up as a prisoner, bringing over, because he and the captain got into some sort of disagreement. Who knows what happened or why, or who was really wrong and who was really right. And he quickly became a leader of this outfit. And the captain said, we need him, and took the chains off and let him have his freedom. He was very good at talking to the Indians. I don't know how, because he didn't speak Algonquin. But when after they arrived, and by the way, they chose one of the worst years to come to Virginia. Drought and extreme cold, and it was not good. And the mosquitoes were terrible. The Indians, Powhatan's tribe, were shocked that these people would settle at Jamestown, because there were so many. They knew that it was a mosquito-infested area. But nevertheless, Captain Newport and John Smith didn't ask the Indians where they should build their fort. But nevertheless, it ended up, and mosquitoes were a serious problem, and many people died of mosquito-borne illnesses. Now, one of the things that has been noted both in South America and Central America, and when the Spanish and Portuguese and the English and French arrived, the women went nuts over them. because they had beards and hairy chests. See, indigenous people, for the most part, did not have, men did, for the most part, some did, big beards. And one reason they all had beards is they didn't want to spend the money for shaving cream, and they didn't want to take the time to shave, so they just let it grow a beard. And, well, the women just thought this was incredibly, they went nuts over these guys. And it's the whole thing, I have this theory, you're always enthralled with whatever's new. You know, when the new car comes out, or whatever the new is for the day, it was a new look. And then it was vice versa. The English men were nuts over the indigenous women. So it was a two-way street. Now, John Smith took one day he was going to go on an exploratory mission, and he took some others with him. And then this story that I'm going to tell tonight has so many twists and turns, and call it serendipity, call it coincidences, call it what you want. But there are a lot of twists and turns in this story. And I'm compressing a 3-hour presentation into 45 minutes. So if I jump around too much, say, please jump back. But nevertheless, he went on this expedition. He told 2 of the people to stop. They wanted to see what was in a certain area. And so they left the canoe with 2 people on them to guard the canoe. And they were going to go further up to see what was there. Well, they were quickly captured by Powhatan's tribe and brought to Powhatan. And Powhatan fed them. Now, what's interesting, the people who were at the canoe were killed, but they treated John Smith like royalty. Now, I don't understand that, but I suspect that the people at the canoe got very defensive and started shooting, or something like that. We don't know. We don't know, but we know they were dead. And I'm thinking, well, why didn't they kill John Smith too? In fact, it was the opposite. They treated him very nicely. At the end of the supper, and this is where it gets, I'm going to give my interpretation, which has not necessarily been validated by modern historians. But they were, after the dinner was over, they took John Smith over and put his head on this stone with these clubs, preparing to beat his brains out. And all of us are familiar with the story that Pocahontas, as an 11-year-old or so, came in and separated herself between her father and John Smith and said, please do not kill him. And he honored his daughter's wishes. Powhatan was very much enthralled with Pocahontas. She was daddy's little girl. And the story goes, then he released John Smith and he went back to Jamestown. Now, some of the stories that we were taught, most of us, that was all we ever learned about Pocahontas, and that she supposedly married John Smith, which is a Disney myth. Then he went back, and they were starving to death. And he literally took over the colony. And food was so scarce. Pocahontas brought them food. And another story that I think that is probably myth is that they were going to ambush John Smith and the colony, and she came over and walked miles to get to Jamestown to warn them that there was going to be an impending attack so they could be ready. That's not been corroborated, and it probably is a myth. But what has been corroborated is her bringing them food. And had that not been the case, the colony would have They literally would have died of starvation, literally died of starvation. So, then John Smith leads the colony a couple of years, and they're able to survive several harsh winters with very little food. And but the relationship with the Indians with the Powhatan's tribe was starting to get, that, let's just say the settlers were wearing out their welcome. Powhatan was not sure what their motive was. Are they here to stay? And he'd ask them, as best they could, in whatever language, however they were pointing or sharing information. But why are you here? And one reason he was being benevolent to them, he wanted guns. He wanted hatchets, because it took a long time to cut down a tree without a hatchet or a saw. He wanted those things. And he was hoping to do some trading, and then they would be on their merry way. And he started noticing more colonists arriving. And at this point, he was starting to get concerned that this might be a permanent situation. Now, the relationship between the Powhatan's tribe and Jamestown is very complicated. I'm going to give some brief summaries of what happened, but it literally would take me hours to go into the details. It started out benevolent, and then it was starting to get, I call it wearing out your welcome. But John Smith, unfortunately, was severely injured. But before he was injured, and this is a story my parents didn't tell me, and my grandparents always they loved telling me these stories too. And they had told me I was a direct descendant of Pocahontas and his father and her father, Powhatan. And we don't know anything about Pocahontas' mother. And so, but I'm going to tell you all the story tonight. And it was suppressed for 250 years. But during one of the encounters that John Smith and some of the others were invited up to where the Powhatan lived, and these young women, no clothes on, did a dance. And then, after the dance, invited the various men who were there to come home with them. And according to John Smith, the story stopped right there. We don't know any other details. But that story was suppressed for 250 years. We couldn't put that in print. So I'm guessing that based on that story, Pocahontas and John Smith were in love with each other. Now, when I first started hearing these stories like this, I was totally disgusted because Pocahontas was 14 and he was 28. But that was a gringo's interpretation of Native American ethic. A woman was considered an adult at 13 and she could get married and make her own choices and chart her own life. My great-grandfather was 19 when he married my great-grandmother, and she was 15. They were married 48 years. Today he would be thrown in prison. So I had to remember that I was putting my lenses, 21st century lenses, on this story. It sounded disgusting. 14-year-old and a 28-year-old. And so I'm guessing they were in love with each other. He then became severely injured and was shipped back to England. And they told, which I thought was very wrong, they told Pocahontas that he had died. I wish they had just said he was injured and the truth, and we had to send him back to England. He never came back to the North American continent again. But thankfully, he wrote down his memoirs. And yes, even if you're a year later, because one time I interviewed this man who wouldn't let me have any notes, any pencils, any paper, certainly not a recorder, no photos, no nothing. And it was a very important story. And if I had it on a recorder, I could have sold it to 60 Minutes. But even in that 1 hour from leaving him and come back to my office to type the details. Now, what did he say? You know, you lose some of the clarity even within a few weeks about what happened. But he did write his accounts. Some of them proved not to be true, but I think some of it was possibly exaggeration, and some of it just to sell a book. But I think some of it was, well, if you can't remember it, just make it up. Some of that. So we know, and by the way, reading his accounts was very challenging for me because he spoke in Middle English. And he would say, "Thou doth." Well, what's that mean? He does. But I had to, even those words are vaguely familiar, I had to translate them into my current thinking. So it slowed me down in reading his accounts. And then the spelling of words was vastly different. But I like to read what people actually said, not what people said they said. And we learned a lot from his memoirs. Now, one of the reasons that modern historians do not think that the story of the Pocahontas being rescued by, John Smith being rescued by Pocahontas is the fact that he wrote that story 20 years later after the fact. So they're dismissing it because if it's something that important, he should have written in his first book, which was about just a few years after he got back to England. So they said, well, he didn't have that in earlier text, and he's now putting that in there? Not true. Well, one reason I think it's true, my interpretation of what happened. The same story happened down in Florida with Juan Ortiz. Juan Ortiz was a Spanish man who was shipwrecked on the coast of Florida, and the tribes down there captured him. And they were, instead of club his brains out, they were going to burn him up. And they put him on top of this pier, and as soon as the flames started to reach his body, the chief's daughter came running up and said, "Daddy, please don't do this." And they took him down, and he lived to tell the story. So we have two counts of that in our history. Also, in the Middle Ages, during the wars of the Middle Ages down in the Middle East, the Knights Templars one of the Knights Templars was captured by the Egyptian Muslim people, and they were going to chop his head off. And the daughter of the Sultan came running up and said, "Daddy, please don't do this." And in each case, it was a young woman, who saved the life of a person who spoke a different language, had a different color skin color, different religion, so forth. And I told these stories to a friend of mine who's a professional Jungian psychology, Carl Jung, and she said, "Tom, this is the perfect archetype. Carl Jung would have loved this story because it's so classical that a young woman saves the life of somebody from an opposite culture." It has a lot of lessons for us today, but I'll go into that another time because I don't want to run out of time. But nevertheless, I think personally these events occurred, but I think they were staged. Because I knew a lot of guys, and they wouldn't tell me for many years because they were supposedly secrets, who were in these college fraternities. And as they got older and maybe over a beer or something, they'd let the story out. They were sworn to secrecy, but they told me. There was always this kind of, quote, near-death experience, and somebody rescues you or something like that while you're blindfolded. And you think you're going to get hit, and then somebody comes up and says, "No, don't do that." So there's remnants of that story, of the Pocahontas story, even in our college fraternities. It's not the same story, but it's remnants. Somebody's going to die, somebody gets rescued. Now, with that said, if any of you are in the fraternities, please come out and tell me your story. But I do think it happened, but I think it was staged and is part of a ceremonial act, because it's too odd to have it one occur in Florida and one occur in Virginia. And in those days, the different distance between Florida and the Virginia was immense. So I do believe it happened. Modern historians think it's a myth, but you can believe what you want. Now, these are some of the early maps of Virginia. Notice the Indian on the far right, and there's one on the far left. This is one of the only images we have of Powhatan, is in the far left. And it's not real good, but it's the only image we have of him. These were done right after the initial settlements at Jamestown. Now, this is what Powhatan's tribe would have looked like, how they lived, how their residents, these are the tribal residences of Powhatan's tribe. And notice that the huts are all round, and at the very top there's a place for the smoke to come out. They had their fires inside the hut, and then notice the curvilinear nature of the hut. I'm not a mechanical engineer, but the Indians, this Powhatan's tribe understood something the people at Jamestown didn't understand, and that is this, that somehow the curvilinear nature of the huts kept the heat in, and they thought it was absolutely stupid that these English colonies were building these square boxes, and they didn't think that they didn't know how they were going to survive the winter, because there was something about the curvilinear nature of these huts that conserved the heat. Also, the way that the fire was in the middle of the hut, which made its permeate the hut at an equidistance. We've discovered Powhatan's home place about 20 years ago in Virginia. After all, and it's on a private residence, and they knocked on the door and said, "Can we dig?" Most people would say no, but he agreed to, and as a result, we found out a lot about the Jamestown colony. Now, on one of the later arrivals came John Rolfe. And John Rolfe was on this ship that shipwrecked at Bermuda because of a hurricane at Bermuda. And and his wife and baby died. They literally took the logs, the wood of the ship that was, and salvaged the wood and reconstructed to make it another ship. And then they got to Jamestown, which I think is a miracle right there. And John Rolfe was one of them. Well, this is another one of the chance encounters that occurred. At this time, once John Smith left Jamestown to go to England, hostilities started to occur between Powhatan's tribe and the colonists. It was hostile. And that's one thing I just admire about John Smith. He knew how to negotiate with the Indians, not the others. But John Rolfe arrives, and in a chance encounter, Pocahontas was in the woods, probably gathering berries. And one of the things, let me jump forward just a second. Our idea of a princess, like Princess Diana, was she had people who helped her get dressed, and she had people who helped her bathe and took care of her clothes, make sure that they got to the cleaners, and so forth. Well, the idea of an Indian princess was vastly different. She was expected to gather berries and nuts through the woods, and by the way, which were infested with rattlesnakes. So they had to teach those children very young to be careful. And she was in the woods foraging for food. And all of a sudden, some of the colonists found her and recognized her and captured her and wanted to use her for some sort of leverage and brought her back to Jamestown. Now, one of the things I wanted to point out before we move forward, the Native Americans thought the English were filthy, and they were. They never bathed. The Native Americans bathed. They were just shocked that these people didn't bathe, and they commented how they stank. And I mean, they never bathed. And I think it was maybe once or twice a year before some sort of christening or at Christmas time or something like that, or Easter. And the English were dumbfounded at the fact that they'd let a princess go gather nuts, because the English princess had people to prepare the food for them. And another thing that the English noticed about the Native Americans, the women worked the fields. And in England, the men worked the fields. And the women were very active in foraging for food, like gathering nuts and gathering berries and so forth. And so, while Pocahontas is captured, John Rolfe falls in love with her, and she falls in love with him. Now, I find this very strange. If somebody captured me, I wouldn't be falling in love with them. But they fell in love with each other. And now, I took 4 years of Spanish in high school, and I can't remember half of it. Within 1 year, she was speaking English. Her English became perfect. And you know, there's so many different tenses and conjugations of verbs in English. There's no, like in Spanish, there's one verb, the rules are same for the preterite, for one of the tenses, except for 3 verbs. It's the same for hundreds of verbs, the same rule. Well, in English, it's a different rule for each tense. And there's exceptions to the rules and that sort of thing. English is a very hard language to learn. And she learned English and adopted the religion, Christianity. Now, I was going to point out this story. I don't believe she gave up her Native American religion for Christianity. I think she adopted both. And the reason I say that, I lived with Indians as part of my college anthropology course in New Mexico. And one of the things I quickly learned is that so many of them were Catholic, but they also practiced their Native American religion. And I asked him, what's your priest think about it? He knows it. So it was kind of there was a general understanding that they practiced both religions. I think she practiced both religions, although the English said she'd given up her, quote, heathen beliefs. I think that's what they wanted, but I don't think that's really happened. That's just my personal belief, based on my observations of Native American practices today in New Mexico. So, and she had to have been a brilliant woman to learn English in a year. And they get married. Now, this is the only authentic, if anybody else says she looked differently, this is the only authentic image we have of Pocahontas. Because when she was in England, that she sat down and posed for a portrait. Unfortunately, she was dressed in English apparel. I wish she had been dressed in Native American apparel, but look at the filigree of the linen around her neck, and the detail and from all accounts, she was stunning. Now, they get married. Now, this was passed down to me, and I promised my parents I would never let it out of the house because they knew I'd lose stuff. So I wanted to bring it tonight to show y'all. So this is the best you're going to get. I don't believe, now this picture was done in the 1850s. My ancestors bought it probably after the Civil War. It's about 100, the picture we have is about 150 years old, something like that. I don't believe the church was that pretty at Jamestown. I really don't. They had built a church. Now, he took his marriage to Pocahontas very seriously. He went to the community rector, and they had prayers over whether this is the right thing to do. And you had to get approval from the captain of the colony, or the governor of the colony, whatever the title was, to get married. That approval was given. And the issue of mixed race was not raised by them at Jamestown. But notice the tribal members are on one side and the English are on the other. I also don't think the English colonists were dressed this nicely at Jamestown. But nevertheless, this picture was done 250 years or 200 years after the fact, but it was based on people's memories that they wrote down at the wedding. Now, this is another picture that was done. I do not own a copy of this, but it's outside. It's the same thing, though. The tribal members are on one side and the settlers are on the other. And notice the service was conducted by a priest. Now, they get married, and let me back up here. They go to England. Well, about 10 months after they get married, a child is born. So the infant son and his mother and father go to England. And Powhatan sent a number of tribal members to go with her. And I'm telling you, she was the town hit. I mean, it was like headline, I'm using modern language. It was headline news all over England. An English prince, and because they perceived her as a princess, see, the Indians didn't call Pocahontas a princess. All they said was she was daughter of a chief. So the English assumed that she was a princess. Princess didn't matter in the Native American thought, but it did with the English. So consequently, as a matter of custom, she was treated like a princess when she came to visit His Majesty James I and Queen Anne. and the monarchs had a party for them. And it was like Scarlett Johansson and Reese Witherspoon arrived at the party. I mean, everybody was enthralled with her. Everybody wanted to talk to her, and they were shocked that she could speak English. And apparently she had been taught all the manners and customs that you do in bowing to the queen and so forth, and to the king, and what you say and don't say to the king and queen. And I mean, she was immediately a hit. And they actually went out to some of the events, and they believed that she went to one of Shakespeare's plays. I mean, and imagine here in Allen, if Scarlett Johansson showed up at an event, it'd be the talk of the town. Now, I mean, they were very interested in her. Unfortunately, some people wrote down what they remembered, what she said, but it's very scant. It was more like how beautiful she was and the clothing she was wearing and how pretty the clothes were. Well, you know, as an elementary historian, I'm really not interested in what they were wearing. I want to know what they were thinking, what their history is, what their sociology is, what their anthropology is, what their religion was. But nevertheless, but unfortunately, she started to feel badly. And some of her tribal members started to feel badly. And so John Rolfe, and by the way, I hope you have figured out by now, she married John Rolfe, and not according to Disney, where she would marry John Smith. I mean, that was the biggest hoax that ever was presented. I think they had a love affair, but I think but most definitely she married John Rolfe. And while she was in London, John Smith tried to approach her, and she treated him with cold shoulder. I think she was very hurt he didn't tell her goodbye. That's just Tom Keener's knowing human nature. And she started to get sick. Well, England, this was around Christmas of 1616, somewhere in there. In London, during the winter, it was a black fog every day, 24/7. And that black fog was there because of coal dust, because people were using coal to keep their houses warm. And it was filthy air. And she started to develop some sort of infection. I think she either had pneumonia or influenza. She did not have smallpox. They described the symptoms, and I described them to a doctor, and they said it was definitely not smallpox. It was probably an respiratory infection of some sort. So he quickly gets her out of the London air, hoping that if he got her into the country and got cleaner air, she'd get better. She got worse. And at Gravesend, England, they stopped and got her out of the boat, hoping that she would get better. And she made a very beautiful statement. She said, "I do not fear death. We will meet again." And she died. And they had one son together, and his name was Tom Rolfe. And he feared, and he was sick, and he was afraid that the child would die if they went back on a boat to Jamestown. So he left the child with some family members, and he went back on a boat back to Jamestown. Now, but before they took off to England, Pocahontas showed John Rolfe how to plant, where the soils were fertile. She taught him about the vagaries of the tidewater climate, and she was very involved with his business. It was like a partnership in his business. And now John Rolfe did something that history knows to this day is a mystery. I think it was a bribe, but the Spanish guarded their seeds to tobacco like Texas Instruments guards its patents with secrecy. They didn't let those seeds, and you could be executed if you stole some seeds and took them somewhere and sold them. The seeds from the tobacco of the Caribbean had a sweet taste. The tobacco did. And one difference between the English and the Native Americans, the Native Americans grew tobacco in Virginia, but it had a bitter taste. They didn't inhale it. They sucked it in their mouth and breathed it out. Well, it had a very bitter taste. And they did that for ceremonial purposes and when people got married or some sort of peace arrangements and so forth. Well, he knew that the English public would not want this tobacco. So he somehow got a hold of these seeds from the Caribbean. And Pocahontas had helped him plant them. And they sprouted and they grew very well. And they took them back to England. Now the English inhaled it and said, "More, please." And so they started planting more tobacco and more tobacco. And so he needed, once his wife died, she had taught him all about the climate and when to plant, what time of the year to plant, and so forth. But once his wife died, he wanted to get back to his crops, left his son in England, and then those tobacco crops became the gold and silver that the English were looking for. And he guarded those seats like you wouldn't believe. He didn't want anybody getting a hold of those seats. And suddenly, and even to this day, you can drive through Virginia and see tobacco being grown. And it grows tall. And it's a nasty harvesting, but it turns into money. So, John Rolfe doesn't live a long time, but his son grows up to 18 and then comes back to Jamestown. At that point, his father is dead. Now, this is a sad story. He wanted to meet, now his grandfather, Powhatan, had died in the meantime, but he wanted to meet Powhatan's brother, and he wanted to meet some of his cousins. And the governor of Virginia said, no way. We don't have anything to do with these people. And I thought that was a sad comment. You know, these are his relatives. He wants to meet them. Let him meet them. Anyways, that was a footnote that I thought was very sad. Now, moving forward. So they had one, Tom Rolfe was the only son. He gets married, and he has a daughter who becomes Pocahontas' granddaughter. And it was Pocahontas' only child because her daughter, the wife of Tom Rolfe dies in childbirth. And they had one baby. Now he remarries and has a bunch of kids, but Pocahontas at this point only had one descendant. Well, she gets married to Robert Bowling, Bolling. Now, I'm changing hats because the story now goes in a different direction. Robert Bowling was an English nobleman whose ancestors occupied this castle in Bradford, England. And so he came from nobility. And I've been to Bradford Castle. And I wondered why we gave it up. It was nice. And although I wouldn't have lived in Bradford because it was like a smokestawn, dirty town when I was there. But the castle is still there. And guess what? It's kept up primarily from funds from Americans, the American Bowling family. They all contribute money to keep it up. And it's a beautiful facility. So, Robert Bowling, he has one child with his wife, and then that wife dies, and then he remarries and has a number of kids with that second wife. They are called White Bowlings. The descendants of the first child and the only grandchild of Pocahontas, they're called Red Bowlings in genealogical circles. Now, when I started my genealogy, it was on microfilm, and it took hours. Now you punch a button and have it in 2 minutes or less. But you had to go through the tapes, and it took for hours. And I was told I was descended from Pocahontas, so that would be a descendant from the first wife. But in 2000, they did a DNA study of my cousins who had carried the male Y chromosome. I wasn't descended from Pocahontas. And I felt like somebody had died. I mean, I was so disappointed. I said, this is a lie. My parents said such and such. Well, it ends up I'm descended from the white Bolings. And so I was telling the shaman I knew who is dead now, but I told him how disappointed, I mean, this was like, how can this be? For 45 years I was told this, and then I'm told it's not true. And this is where it's important you have to go with the records and not what Mama says. But there was a Bible back in the 1700s that was written, it's in the old big Bibles, there was a page that said births, marriages, and deaths. And each time one happened, you wrote it in the page. And it was in the middle between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And somebody wrote down that their grandparent was Pocahontas. And I don't think they were lying, because at the time it was not something to be boastful that you had an Indian blood in you. In fact, there used to, up until the 20th century, there used to be this horrible term called one drop of blood and you're tainted or something like that. I just, it was some kind of racist comment. And so it wasn't something to be boastful about, to say you had Native American ancestry. I think in 100 years, people's memories fade and they get it twisted. And it ended up, I'm a white Boling. So I was telling the shaman this and how disappointed it was. He said, Tom, you gringos don't get it, do you? I said, what do you mean? He said, Pocahontas' soul lives within you. What a treasure that is. And let her continue to resonate inside your soul and share her story, which I have been for 60 years. So it doesn't matter that I'm not DNA linked. I'm linked through marriage, not DNA. Marriage. Now, Pocahontas' legacy. Now, I was told that she was a cousin, and she is. She's the wife of Woodrow Wilson. She is considered the first acting female president we ever had. She was the first lady, Edith Bolling Wilson, to be involved with her husband's presidency. Woodrow Wilson became president in January of 1913. In 1914, his first wife, died of kidney disease. Edith Wilson's first husband died of something, and before he entered the White House. In 1914 or 15, he marries her, and at the White House, and she became very active in his presidency. And one of the first difficult decisions that was made, he wanted to appoint Louis Brandeis to the Supreme Court. President Wilson did. He was Jewish, and he told his wife that I will get criticism because of that. And she said, you do what's right. So he appointed Brandeis, who ended up being one of the best jurists we ever had. And he was the first Jewish man on the Supreme Court. And so she was very active in the decision-making. And she is a red Boling. I've done her genealogy. Now, after she left the White House, she campaigned for President Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt idolized Woodrow Wilson and Edith Bolling Wilson. Because Woodrow Wilson gave Franklin Roosevelt his first political position. He was undersecretary in Wilson's cabinet. So he gave him his first political position. As a result, the Roosevelt family never forgot the Wilsons. And this was Eleanor Roosevelt greeting Edith Bowling Wilson in the 1950s. And at the age of 88, she went out campaigning for President Kennedy. And that's her in 1961. And that's some of the President Wilson's grandchildren. And at the White House. And she died about 4 or 5 months after this. This is Colonel Bowling, who was the first highest ranking officer killed in World War I. He's a Red Bowling. That is Alexander Bowling Sr., a general during World War II and during the Cold War. That's with Harry Truman's Secretary of the Army. I think his name was Rice. He's a Red Bowling. That's Alexander Bowling Jr. He was a general. Oh, by the way, this man here, a Air Force Base was named for him in Washington, D.C. It's called Bowling Air Force Base. That's Alexander Bowling, General Bowling, and I have to tell you a story. I went over to his house one time, and I was having a devil of a time getting some records from the Pentagon about one of my family members. And all they were giving me was red tape, red tape, red tape. He said, "One moment, please." He picked up the phone, didn't even look at his Rolodex, remember the Rolodex, and called the Pentagon. And he had this stature about him, even though he had been retired, he still had this stature. And he said, "This is General Bowling. I want such and such delivered to such and such address, please. Thank you very much." It was in my mail the next day. I learned the power of being a general. Even if you're retired, you've got power. This is my grandfather Bowling. He's a white Bowling. These other Bowlings, they're red Bowlings. But we're all cousins by marriage. Now, finally, in 1979, my cousin on my father's side, not related, my Bowling ancestry is through my mother. She calls me up and says, "Tommy, I'm getting married. Congratulations. Who's the lucky man?" "A man named Richard Bowling." I could tell she didn't want to talk about him or say much about him. She was a very modest person. I said, "Well, Richard Bowling, there's a congressman who's head of the Rules Committee his name is Richard Bowling. Any relation?" There was a long pause. "Well, that's him." "You're marrying a congressman and you didn't tell me who majored in history?" So, he's a red Bowling. And she said, and I said, "You know, my mother was a Bowling." And I said, "So we're going to have 2 sets of Bowlings in the family." He's a red Bowling, I'm a white Bowling. And one thing I'm very proud of him about, he was probably more than anybody was able to get the '64 Civil Rights Act passed through the Congress. He voted for every single civil rights legislation and voting rights legislation. So Pocahontas still is affecting and influencing American government today, although he's dead now. But what I'm trying to say is she has 100 to 300,000 descendants from that one baby. And those are red Bowlings. And then she's got tons of white Bowlings who are related to her through marriage, like I am. And finally, the last legacy of Pocahontas in Allen, Texas. I have presented probably over 20 Native American programs here. And I can assure you, each one of them, because Pocahontas influenced me to share the story of the Native Americans with y'all. That's the legacy of Pocahontas in Allen, Texas. Questions, comments, protests? He's going to, I usually do the mic. He's going to, so I don't have to climb the stairs. Thank you, Aaron.
So I was curious, all these relatives were in England. How did they come back to the United States? How did that all work out? Was it when they came back to the Jonestown, to the Jamestown?
Rolfe came back, but his son stayed in England. And he had hoped after they left the castle functions at Buckingham Palace, or whatever the palace was at the time, he had hoped to introduce her to his relatives there in England and then come back. But he left his only son there and then came back. The son never saw his father again. But when he grew up, he went back to Jamestown, mainly for financial reasons. Did I answer your question? Yeah. Questions, comments? There's one over here.
I'm a little bit confused about.
I am too.
The red and the white.
Yeah.
So can you explain it one more time? That the son of Pocahontas.
I'll explain it one more time because I have to explain it to myself all the time.
So he got married. They had one child. They had
Yes.
a daughter.
Because the mother died at childbirth.
And so all of her descendants are considered the red.
No, it started with Robert Bowling. The Pocahontas, John Rolfe did remarry, but he had another child named Elizabeth. I don't think she survived to adulthood. So there was only one child from that marriage, and that was Tom Rolfe. Then Tom Rolfe marries a woman named Jane, and it's a name I don't know how to pronounce. And probably Welsh or something like that, because it's a bizarre name. Anyways, he marries her. Then she dies in childbirth. And then they have a daughter. She grows up to be an adult. She marries Robert Bowling. Then Robert Bowling gets married, and the wife dies. There's one child. He remarries, though, and has a bunch of children with wife number 2. That's where I come in. Now, the thing I tell you, one reason I was trying to impress upon you, by the way, are there any members of the Collin County Genealogical Society here? One of the reasons that I try to, the story that my parents and grandparents told me was half true, but they halfway got it wrong, not because somebody lied, it's just information gets twisted. But nevertheless, so all the children from wife number 2 of Robert Bowling are considered white Bowlings. See, he didn't enter the picture. He was not in on the early settlements at Jamestown. He came about 50 years later, 40 years later. So my ancestry doesn't go back to that I have found yet. The original settlement at Jamestown, it came through Bowling, who came in 50 years later. And then he has 2 marriages. Wife number 1 dies, and they have that one child. And that one child marries and has like 15 kids. And then the next generation has 15 kids, and each one of them has 15 kids. That's how within 400 years, there's almost 100,000 descendants or more of Pocahontas living in the United States. And by the way, I had Congressman Bowling, and I said, did you ever meet Mrs. Wilson? Of course. He said she was kind of the star of the town when he came to Washington, and he made several courtesy calls to see her, since they were cousins. And anyways, that's, did I answer your question?
A little bit. I would have to see a family tree to really understand.
Okay, Pocahontas, Rolfe, have one child, Tom Rolfe. He marries, she dies in childbirth, the wife did, and they have one child, a grandchild, and she marries Bowling, and she dies, but the child survived. And those descendants are all Red Bowlings. And then he remarries, and then he has lots of kids. In those earlier generations, I don't think there was any surviving children that made it to adulthood. So it gets complicated when the Bowling marries two people, and you have all these white Bowlings and you have all these red Bowlings. And genealogists, that's the term they use. I usually don't use that term anymore, red, but that's still what they're referred to. Jan. Red and white wine. Questions? Yes, sir.
All right, so you have all this wonderful genealogy from the Jamestown group, but what about the Indians that stayed here, that were native Indians, her whole tribe?
All right, that's a good question. They were almost stamped out. They were almost eliminated, mainly from disease. A lot of them contracted smallpox and influenza and pneumonia. The English were brought over, and they didn't have any resistance to it, none whatsoever. And I'm sorry to say that the Powhatan tribe didn't survive. Now, some of the other Tidewater tribes did, and just in the last few years, they've been nationally recognized, finally recognized. But Powhatan's tribe did not make it. And if I had another 3 hours, I could have gone into that. But it was a sad story. It basically death by infection, and then a lot of them were moved out. Questions in the back?
Hey, Tom,
Yeah.
who again is the lady in the picture there next to Carter and between Carter and Bowling?
Okay, that's my cousin, Dr. Prudy Orr. She died last year, and she was married to him. And in 1979, President Carter invited them up to Camp David, and I thought, holy smoly, I mean, really? And I thought she was making this up. She sent me the pictures, so, and see, that's signature from Jimmy Carter. June 2nd, 1979, he dated it. And I asked her what the purpose was. And they were discussing the campaign strategy for next year in 1980, the presidential campaign. That's another topic for another time.
And she was a legislator?
Her husband was Congressman Bowling, who was
Right.
chairman of the Rules Committee, and he could have easily have blocked the civil rights legislation in Congress, but he did not. He pushed it through.
But she was your relative on the opposite side of the family.
She's
then.
my cousin. She was my cousin, and so by marriage he is.
But
So I
but
got
on the
all these
opposite,
Bowlings by marriage and some by
but
ancestry.
on the opposite side of the family than the white Bowlings.
He's a red Bowling.
Right. Okay.
What I'm trying to say is, there's still, and by the way, Cokie Roberts' daughter, the late Cokie Roberts, just wrote a book on Mrs. Wilson, and I'm looking forward to making contact with her to discuss my memories of what Mr. Bowling had told me about his memories of Mrs. Wilson. Questions, comments, protests?
Tom, thank you. This is very interesting. But can you tell me any more about the tobacco plantations or the tobacco that he said
You know
he
what?
wanted?
The answer is yes. And the reason I didn't say much about it, I just hate to think that our country was formed on the basis of tobacco. That was the motive. That was what transformed those valleys and area, those fields. They became gold mines because the English couldn't get enough of tobacco. And the Spaniards were upset because they wondered how the English got a hold of their seeds. And that was a big deal. And then once we got their seeds, it became a gold mine. And one reason Tom Wolfe came back as an adult, his daddy willed him his plantation of tobacco. And he saw dollars on the vines of those tobacco vines. And I've been through the fields because I wanted to see and there's lots of tobacco still grown in tobacco in America, in Virginia. And I have seen those fields. And it's just hard for me to imagine that our country was formed because of tobacco. Once it became successful, then all of a sudden more Indians were pushed out to get more soil, to make more room for tobacco, and forget corn or the other things that we need for sustenance. Tobacco was the gold mine of the day. And another thing, which is another topic for another day, rum was a big reason we had the American Revolution. That's another topic. It's hard for me to put my arms around the fact that our American Revolution was partly started by rum. That's another story. But tobacco was a major, major crop. And yes, when Tom Rolfe came back, he made the fields even more. He bought more land. As he made more money, he bought more land. And then all of a sudden, he was making a fortune. Yes?
In Gravesend, in England, where Pocahontas' resting place is at.
We don't know.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask.
that's
Is there
sad.
ever a moment where they're trying to find the exact location of her body?
We have tried and tried to find the grave. And she's buried in Gravesend, which is an odd name, but that's the name of the city, along the Thames River. And there's probably a shopping center over her, or condominiums over her grave. I suspect they planted a wooden cross, and within 100 years it or less disintegrated. And a lot of graves were planted, not just hers, but all throughout the Americas with wooden crosses. And all these people went west in their wagons and somebody died, and you plant them in the field, put a wooden cross there. 100 years later, it's a corn crop. Any questions, comments? Anything I should have said and didn't say, or shouldn't have said and did say?